Yeah.
And the tradition was if you're doing British PhD, you got to go. You went to England. So I had a Leverhulme Fellowship that happened to be at University College.
Right.
But the University College English department at that time didn't teach anything beyond the 18th century. And just a few years later, Frank Kermode came and it became kind of a major department. But
Yeah.
and I was doing a 20th century thesis, so there was literally nobody to talk to. So I just used the library, and I was reading 19th century stuff, and many of the books had never been read. The pages were uncut, so there was a beadle outside the library. I would take the book to him. He would slice the pages.
That's incredible.
So, but in any event, in those days, many British academics could only get an MA, which really was the equivalent, essentially, because of the differences in the system.
Yeah, well, basically, it's the MS was the main element of it was this 35,000 word thesis that you write at the end, whereas I think in MA it's 20.
I see.
That's the difference. But doing a PhD isn't 4 times that. You don't multiply that by 3 or 4.
No.
And that's the thing I've only just come to realise.
I see. Okay, so I have only one piece of advice for you. You have to remember, the people who I know who never finished their PhDs were the people who really thought they were going to write a major piece of work.
Right.
And so forget that.
Yeah.
Just produce the damn pieces.
Yeah.
Because you can do whatever later.
Yeah.
But if you think you're going to change the world, then you'll never finish.
Yeah. No,
I mean, it's very tempting.
Yeah.
One thinks, but it's very dangerous thought.
Yeah. There are a lot of people I know who are a fair bit further on or who have finished. It's sort of testament to the grueling process of it.
Yeah,
really.
just do it.
Just get it done.
Yeah, just get it done.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to ask a little bit of background, some of which you've covered. So sorry if you end up missing a little bit.
That little gadget.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
Wow.
This little thing.
How fabulous! I mean, because I'm used to the old.
Yeah.
Little boxes.
I've just bought it for this trip. It's hundreds and hundreds of hours on this thing. Yeah, it's amazing. Okay, so first of all, I was wondering, sort of what time did you arrive in England? What university did you attend? What were you studying and why you chose England? So a little bit of background on why you were in England, basically.
So as I said earlier, so I was a PhD student at Stanford.
Right.
And I was doing a PhD on the relationship between 19th century British aesthetics and modernism, concentrating on Virginia Woolf and Ford Madox Ford. And I was awarded a Leverhulme Fellowship, which was, I actually have never had so much money in my life. The exchange rate was phenomenal. You got £3 to the dollar. And, I lived on 10 shillings a week. It was just spectacular.
Well, the way things are going, you may well get £3 for your dollar again.
I lived in the house. Professor John O. Wisdom, professor of scientific method at the LSE, was going to UCLA for the year. Another a friend of mine from Stanford, a poet, John Matthias, and I lived in his house. So I had a Leverhulme Fellowship to University College London, where I was essentially writing my thesis.
Right. Excellent.
That's what I was doing there.
And in terms of background to your protesting, had you protested before you came to England before?
Yes.
And in what context was that?
Well, I went to Tufts as an undergraduate, where I was the editor of the student paper. At that time, the universities, certainly Tufts, the fraternity system was very big, and the fraternities had openly discriminatory policies against Jews and black people. And I'd written these editorials in the paper. I was actually burnt in effigy. So it was partly to do with the civil rights movement, and partly also the early days of really what was the American equivalent of SANE, the anti-nuclear movement. There was the first March on Washington in 60 what? 2 maybe? And so at the early days of that movement, and when I got to Stanford, obviously it was maybe the year after the free speech movement, the draft was on. Some of my friends from Tufts also had gone to Stanford, and we started a graduate student radical paper, which I edited. It eventually led to a lot of anti-war activity. We had to sit in the president's office at Stanford. So there was quite a bit of, back and forth between people at Stanford and people at Berkeley. I mentioned Dave Harris and Sweeney, so these people had come up from the civil rights movement. They were looking for what to do. So there was quite a lot of political activity.
What year was this, do you remember? So it was 62, 63?
Well, it was 63 to 66. I started at Stanford in the fall of 63 when Kennedy was killed.
And then you travelled to England
in 66.
In 66. And so there was this background of protesting here.
Yes.
And there was a bit of a dovetailing, you say, with the civil rights movement.
Yes.
And so then
we essentially started an SDS chapter at Stanford, etc.
So with the SDS, I can't remember what year they were formed.
It couldn't have been much earlier. So it would have been 62, maybe 61. It was thereabouts.
Port Huron.
The Port Huron statement. I don't remember the date of it.
And so, with this background, you moved to England. You're carrying out your research, and then.
So I was standing at a bus stop at the British Museum. No, somewhere. Looking, I thought very British. I had on a pair of winkle pickers, which were these shoes which came to a pointy thing. All the clothes I was wearing, I bought in England. And this girl approached me with a leaflet saying, "You're an American, aren't you?" I said, "How do you know I'm an American?" She said, "We're having a meeting about Vietnam. Maybe you'd like to come." So it was the stopping committee meeting, and I went.
So this was a British girl?
No, it was an American girl.
An American girl who was approaching you, and she was sort of generating support for this stopping committee?
Yes.
So that's the first time you'd heard of the stopping committee?
Yes.
Or... Right, okay. And so when she mentioned this to you, you were immediately interested in that. I mean, you obviously had this background of protesting. You felt this compulsion to involve yourself with protesting against the Vietnam War, and this was a good way in.
Right.
Before that, you hadn't sought out any group, or
right.
Had you? And in terms of your motivation behind that, was that? I mean, obviously, what was going on was horrific in Vietnam, even at this fairly early stage. What was your motivation? Obviously, the American money that was being pumped into it, into the war effort,
yeah.
Huge amount of money, and so there was domestic issues that were perhaps not being looked at as much as, or receiving money which perhaps should have been receiving money. Johnson's Great Society, all of that. Was that in any way a part of your motivation behind protesting, that it was the domestic element that was suffering?
No.
It was...
I mean, I think that for me, and I'd say for more or less everybody I knew, you know, people just got radicalized, quote unquote. I mean, it's an easy, we use the term today. But what would happen is, the Port Huron statement would get written, which would get written just because you'd think the wrong, which I think people felt as moral. You know, because essentially I think that the way that we experienced this was not through a full understanding of what politically was happening in the sense you just raised it, but rather that there were these naked guys in Vietnam and there were these B-52 bombers bombing them. You know, so the discrepancy seemed grotesque, really. That money and that use of power. So you would soon start reading Marx and investigate protest movements, and so, because essentially, if you were going to go outside of the system and try to understand a situation like Vietnam, let's say, you know, really, where do you go? So basically, people became people like me. I would say all the people who became active, you know, not the massive students, but people who became active, would have followed the same route. You would start trying to learn something. You would, you know. So it wasn't the kind of motivation you suggested. And you would think the system was wrong, and you had to learn it. So you became persuaded. You had to organize to do that. To do political work, raise people's consciousness, bring the system to a halt. All that.
And so you.
Can you turn that off for a minute while I get some water?
Of course.
Shouldn't be talking and waving. Fortunately, you don't have me on camera, so it'd be fine.
Yeah, that's the benefit. Right.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's interesting that was your way in, through this girl just coming up to you and speaking about it. So she invited you to this meeting, and that took place
in Roslyn Hill. Harry Pincus, have you run across his name?
Yeah, I wrote
his
about
apartment.
It, yeah.
The meetings were held at his apartment. So Harry, and I don't remember his roommate's name, they were the main.
Heinz Norden? Was it Heinz Norden, the other?
Perhaps. I forgot.
That's okay. So,
you know, and Harry had been there already. I can't remember what he was doing in London. He was the boyfriend of Gene Kelly's daughter, Kerry Kelly.
Yeah, I've got in touch with her as well.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
Because he committed suicide.
That's right. Yeah.
I wound up living in this apartment. She lived on England's Lane. But the meetings were held there. They were held maybe weekly. I can't recall.
And this was what year was this? Do you remember?
I think this is 67.
67. And so it was.
Or it's 67. I think it's 67.
And so Harry was the one who formed the...
I don't know for sure. He was certainly the person who ran it, but when I went to the meeting, so I'm assuming he did. And I think, it mushroomed at that time.
So when you first went, how many people do you remember there being?
20 maybe.
Right. And when you say it mushroomed, it grew to...
I don't know the number really. It can't have been a huge number. But you had elections for officers.
Yeah.
And I think its activities became significantly enlarged.
And in terms of your role in it, what was that? Did you?
That's a really good question. Well, I had some sort of leadership role. How did that develop? I did eventually get elected to a core committee. There was like debates about who should be given. There was an election contest. But I was, as things developed, we did two things that I can remember anyway that are quite concrete, aside from regular, ongoing things. We decided to do these publications, which I was in charge of.
Right.
We rented an office. I found an office on Fleet Street.
Wow.
The address of which I can't remember. It was a fourth floor walk-up or something.
Okay.
These two bare rooms, which had almost nothing in it, but it was on Fleet Street.
Yeah.
And we organized for this big demonstration. It must have been in the spring of '68. And I went around the country, trying to talk to people to get people to come, and so forth. And there was a national umbrella organization for this demonstration. And within the Stop It committee, there were various groups. There was the guy from the Socialist Workers' Party. There were a bunch of us who were like New Left, American New Left people. I don't know if he had a formal name, which involved Henry Wurtis. He had been in England because he was doing research. He's a biologist. And he was friends with the Richmonds, who were British, not British doctor, the doctor. And they had a kind of, both of them had some former Communist Party and had left it and were trying to, and that was the connection to the British New Left movement.
Right.
There were little subgroups within, responsible for this and responsible for that within Stop It.
And so when you say you went around the country drumming up support, was that drumming up support amongst the British or Americans?
Yes.
You're trying to get as much support as possible.
It was British, basically, right? So.
And was this you say the umbrella organisation? Was this the VSC, the
Yes.
Vietnam Solidarity? Yeah. Obviously run by Tariq Ali.
I think, I don't know if he ran it, actually. I think somebody else actually ran it.
He was a bit of a figurehead for it.
Right, he was, and it remains.
Yeah.
A guy who, if you had a stage, he would go on it, but
Sure.
I don't think he actually did any work. I think that the organization was not run by him.
Right. And so you have this umbrella organisation which Stop It was a part of. Did you Were there any other American groups that you knew of at the time?
I don't remember them. I think we thought of ourselves as the main American group.
Right.
I wasn't aware, nor was I in contact with, who was doing what in the Army. You know, you said there was a paper, underground paper there. I didn't know who those people were.
Yeah.
You know, Dennis Sweeney came through on his way to he was meeting the Vietnamese in Paris, and he mentioned, you know, people in the Army, but I didn't know who they were.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, part of my study looks at comparative element with Germany and Japan. It's massive in Germany. I mean, the military thing in Germany was huge. In Britain, it was fairly small. So it doesn't surprise me that you don't remember much.
Right, and in 67, 68, so I had to leave Roman Fellowship for a year, but I stayed. And in 67, 68, you know, I made what I to eat. I taught in University of Maryland Broad program in the Air Force.
Oh.
So I went out and taught freshman English to these soldiers.
And where was that?
At a couple of bases. I can't even remember. Well, one was just outside of Cambridge. Where was the other one? And on occasion, so a soldier would approach me and say, you know, we hear there's a demonstration on. You know anything about that? But I basically stayed out of it. I mean, I didn't, you know. Yeah. But it was ironic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. And in terms of the, you know, obviously you came to the stop it once it had been formed. Mm-hmm. Do you know how it formed? I mean, was it from university groups or?
I don't know.
Okay. And in terms of Britons you were involved with, were there any British intellectuals either at the LSE, and famously Miliband was there, very involved in a British New Left movement. Was there any intellectuals who inspired your group that you remember of? No. Now these are some questions, tedious questions, I'm sure, but I just want to try and.
I mean, there were, you know, you should ask that question of some of the people who were at LSE you're going to go to when you go to.
Yeah.
You know, I wasn't really a student in the universities.
Yeah.
So, and clearly, the Stop It people, and the British people worked together, but there wasn't a sense of looking to some British figures as inspiration. It was very American oriented.
In terms of raising money, do you remember how that was organised at all?
No.
Duration of the group?
Well, it certainly was there until I left the country, so I don't know what happened after 68.
So it was in 68 that you left?
Yes, I left in the summer of 68.
And so did you attend any protests up to that point, the one that you were organising for?
Right.
And that was a big protest, Grosvenor Square?
Grosvenor Square.
Trafalgar Square. And the American contingent that went to that, the Stop It contingent that went to that, did you produce your own banners and things, or was it? So you were
Americans against, Stop It Committee, Americans against Americans in Britain opposed to the Vietnam War stuff. Yeah. And there was you had your place in the march. There was a lot of issues about how you should behave at this march. Were you going to be peaceful or not, and so forth.
And in terms of that sort of idea of protesting, the sort of legality of protesting and pushing the boundaries, and what was your view on that? Do you remember what your
Well, I mean, I don't think there was too much discussion or thought about the legality of it. There was a lot of discussion and thought about the politics of it.
Yeah.
In other words, was the point to throw things at the U.S. Embassy or to affect public opinion by showing you were responsible political grouping? But my roommate for the year before, John Mathias, married the half-sister of the wife of Wayland Young, who was a junior minister in Wilson's cabinet. And I called him after one of these demonstrations, after this demonstration, and said, you know, I wonder if you could tell me whether you're planning to deport Americans who were active. And he said, you know, and I think in retrospect, obviously, you know, what a stupid thing for me to do. What could the poor guy say? But he said, whatever the laws are, we will uphold the laws. If you did something that was legal, there won't be any issue.
Right. Huh.
That didn't turn out to be altogether correct. But it was largely correct in the sense that people were not concerned about whether it was legal.
Yeah. But it was fascinating what you mentioned earlier on, that you got married and you wanted to go to Paris on this honeymoon.
Right.
And then you obviously applied for a visa or whatever process.
Well, no, I didn't do anything. I could go to Paris without really having a visa.
So which was the bit where you were told or you were phoned up?
Well, yeah, I was someone who worked at the Home Office or the Foreign Service. One of these had told someone in the stopping committee who told me that if I left the country, I wasn't getting back in.
And so what happened with that? Did you leave?
No, I didn't. No.
So you just didn't go?
I went to Canada. In Canada, if you were curious, and I've never followed this up, the Royal Mounted Secret Police, they followed me regularly. They checked what they did all my mail. I have an uncle who they visited, whom they told I should behave myself, and I was going to get thrown out of the country. But nobody ever really did throw me out of any country. So,
So in terms of, obviously returning to Canada, you were mentioning that you weren't allowed back into the States because you burnt your draft card.
Right.
So you went to Canada. This was in '68.
Summer '68.
And you then did what in Canada? What was your...
So I had a job at a college called Loyola of Montreal. And as I said earlier, I ran something called the American Deserters Committee.
And then that was, this was your group, you formed this?
No, it had already been formed. I was basically asked to take it over.
Right, and sorry, where was that? That was in...
Where was it? Montreal.
Montreal. And how many individuals did you help?
Oh, a large number. Well, I think we saw hundreds of deserters, but we probably landed somewhere between 70 and 100, meaning we got papers for it in a year or two.
So this was about 2 years that you were involved in?
Yes.
Yeah. So you'd say hundreds of people?
Oh, yes.
And so once you'd been involved with that, you then said that you were allowed back into the United States.
Right.
To travel back. So that was 70-ish?
Right.
And did you continue protesting in the United States?
Yes.
And in what capacity was that? Was that you were attached to a group, or?
Well, so I returned to the U.S. and some of the people from the stopping committee had also returned.
Yeah.
Some of them were in Boston. So originally, Henry Wirtis, Meredith Tax, Dave Slaney, and his wife.
Yeah.
So they had already formed a group. It was just a kind of community organizing group.
Right.
There was and a bunch of us also organized. There were some people from Stanford who had gone to graduate school who were at UMass. And we eventually organized a socialist faculty group, and we were active through the university as well.
I suppose it's a new question, really. I mean, the most successful part of this, I take it, or your protesting in general during these years, it sounds incredible what you were managing to do in Canada. Would you figure that was your
Well, that was the most concrete thing, that's for sure.
Yeah.
That was genuinely did something.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise, I think that everybody devoted there were three things that people devoted that took people's time. Going to meetings, which I'll say something more about. Then organizing events, which may have been small demonstrations, talks, large demonstrations, protests, and then genuinely actually doing something.
Yeah.
Meaning in this case, as far as the deserters certainly went, that was very concrete. The meetings, but I think that, I'm not sure if you've run across this. The meetings were both incredibly time-consuming.
Incredibly
time-consuming.
Yeah.
Probably the central emotional experience. And both destructive and constructive. Because you spend your time in these rooms, it's like, I'm assuming what happened to Lenin. You spend your time in these small groups, talking about what you should do, and what's ideologically correct, and so forth. Most of which, in retrospect, of course, seems laughable. But I think the dynamic of these groups was both very exhilarating. The sense of being a vanguard naturally is essential for the group to come, but also functions. It makes you feel a vanguard.
Yeah.
But the vanguardy part of it is, of course, about all this ideological bullshit, basically.
Yeah.
Which starts in a sensible place, but quickly builds to, a party line of one form or another, introducing warfare, so on and so forth.
And it does that because there's so many different individuals who are having their pennies worth. They're all discussing different elements, and it becomes a bit.
Yes, because, well, I think partly it's a natural process. I mean, what if once you get your PhD, you will presumably try to get a university position. It'll be in
history. So yeah.
So the history department you're in will have the same dynamic.
Right.
I mean, it won't be quite as intense because you're not doing something within the law and so forth. But right? That famously, the high table is famously bitchy.
Yeah.
So take this and make it, vaguely not legal, conspiring to overthrow the government, or in any event to do X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
That's what you'll get. And of course, what happened to SDS was that it splintered into a variety of ideological groups. You know, some following versions of Chinese communism, some following, you know, so there are all these groups with their papers. But Black Panthers in the U.S. were very influential. You know, what had happened to the civil rights movement for the people who had remained, who were in the States, which obviously I had missed out on. So the period from 66, you know, through 70 was very dramatic in terms of when you left in the States. So all those things filtered through.
And obviously at this point, with this fragmenting, there was, and you've alluded to it, that there was a fair amount of violence that erupted in certain quarters. And how did you view that at the time, and how do you view that now?
Well, there was a lot of obvious you know, I'm not sure how to characterize it properly, but you know, the violence was of a variety of sorts. You know, there was throwing stones at the police, which I think was not a serious issue in the sense that it was no more serious than people being really angry and having nowhere to exert their frustrations. I was not seriously disturbed by that in any way. On the other hand, there was a lot of self-delusion. For example, the Deserters Committee, when I was running it in Montreal, held a conference in Montreal for the American left to talk about the war and aspects of the war. And Tom Hayden came in. And he said to this group of deserters that they should return to the country and join the movement in the U.S. And I was like beside myself with anger at this, because these poor guys were going to go bloody well get arrested, they, you know, and get thrown into the, you know, they had deserted.
Yeah.
So that was just a small level of of delusion. I mean, of irresponsibility. Who the fuck was he to tell them to go and get thrown into the brig? You know, to cavalierly come in. To, you know, Bernardine Dorn thinking that a very beautiful woman, thinking that, you know, the revolution was coming and we should start blowing people up. Yeah. You know, you say, what revolution is coming? You know, exactly. So there was, you know, it was very the combination of the dynamics of these processes, you know, individual psychology, led to a lot of you know, arrogant, you know, really delusory activity on the part of very smart people. I mean, it was an object lesson in how being smart is really potentially the worst thing you want to be in situations which require human leadership.
That's fascinating that you say that. And can you expand on that a little bit? Being
well,
smart.
because Well, I'll give you an analogous story. I have a very good friend who is extremely smart and who I had an argument with. I was the president of my local school board for a few years. And so, and he's always been interested in the way that technology can be used in business ways, and so he was advocating for use of computers in classroom to help, so this is to make me feel godlike. Let there be light.
I need one of those.
And in any event, the long and the short of it was that the reform movement, what's called the reform movement within American education, testing and all this crap, is the product, I think, of very smart people, well-intentioned smart people. Well-intentioned smart people think of well-intentioned smart ideas, but they don't think of how they'll actually affect normal, ordinary people. So the people in the classroom, most classrooms in the country, and most teachers in the country, are not very smart people. They're just ordinary people.
Yeah.
So when you take these very smart ideas and translate them into the classroom, or into the bureaucracy, in particular, of education, they become disastrous ideas. And so the fact that the people were so smart to begin with disqualified them from understanding what happens to these ideas when they need to be brought into real life. And this happens in spades in left-wing politics, or this kind of revolutionary politics. And you can see it in Lenin, Mao, etc. Where it becomes ideologically important to think a certain way, and you wind up killing thousands of people.
That's fascinating. And finally, just to sort of wrap up, how do you view your role back then? I mean, how do you view your time back then now? Your years of protesting, your years of involvement in this. I mean, it's become such a whole period to look back on now, culturally, socially, politically.
It's kind of amazing period. I mean, first of all, we were young, younger than you. I assume more than anybody, let's say your age. I'm not sure how old are you?
37.
37. Oh well, much younger than you.
Oh well, I'll take those as a compliment.
People in their 20s, early 30s, so their 20s essentially. People in their 20s. So it was a very intoxicating. That you could so dramatically engage in the shape of human events. It was, and these things actually happened. I don't know. I remember before stopping. I don't know. There was some demonstration when I first arrived in London, which must have been CND or something, I don't know. But stepping out of the tube, there was a mass of people. Well, that can be very exciting. This huge mass of people, When I was touring the country, I went to Leeds. They were demonstrating against Enoch Powell. There was this massive demonstration going down the middle of Leeds. And they were chanting, "Disembowel Enoch Powell." So there's a kind of fun element to the whole thing. So it was a lot of fun. It's very exhilarating. It was enormously educational. I mean, you learned a lot of stuff. I mean, I think the notion that you could enact a revolution seemed really then, but seems in retrospect very misguided.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, given the circumstances, there clearly are times, we're probably living through a time, when normal politics is quite ineffective.
Yeah.
In fact, more than ineffective.
Yeah.
And so politics has to be taken outside of normal politics. And then you have both the rational and the irrational working big time. But I look, on the most part, I think I look back at it, with as having been. I mean, I had a fabulous time, and the other thing about it was, I think for many of us, it felt morally correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
So clearly people thought it was morally correct to blow people up, but it nevertheless felt that what was going on was tremendously immoral.
Yeah.
That people were just being slaughtered. It was wrong, and it was the product of a system that was immoral, and so that what you were doing was morally correct. It had that quasi-religious quality to it. And furthermore, it was really immoral. What was going on really, at least, from my point of view, was really immoral.
Yeah.
And what people thought they were doing was really moral. So that was, again, a very, important thing. I mean, we haven't talked about culture at all. I mean, there was this huge cultural change. That affected, I think, everybody of my generation. I mean, everybody didn't go through Marxist discussion groups, but everybody really did listen to the Beatles or something. Yeah. And so you had the sense of a wholesale transformation of society going on, of which you were not just a part, but of which you were a leading part.
Yeah.
And you were, so it was persuasive that you could change society.
I suppose you were of an age where you recognised that you were going through something special. I mean, obviously, had people been younger, it's very difficult to see it objectively. So you were mid-20s, late 20s, so you were very well aware that there had been this shift. There had been
Absolutely.
This, yeah.
Yes, because I in particular, people. So I was a little bit older than the mainstream, just a little, a year or two or three.
Yeah.
But meaning, I grew up in the 50s.
Yeah.
So it was the transition from the 50s to the 60s, which was very dramatic.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if I think of it now in retrospect, the thing which is alarming, given where we are, is that the social changes in the U.S., and I guess everywhere, certainly London, for example, there's no resemblance to the London I knew. There weren't any black people in London, or three maybe, and in one Indian restaurant or something.
Yeah.
It's a slight exaggeration.
Yeah.
And certainly you couldn't eat the food. Social changes, meaning race, gender, all of that has been remarkable. But that people's wages have not moved since 1970. That is a devastating criticism of us, I guess. That there has been no economic movement for what, 5 decades?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just staggering. So how did that happen?
Yeah.
And I really don't know the answer to how that happened. But obviously we're seeing the upshot of that.
Yeah.
Furthermore, my generation, allowed the labor movement to be totally destroyed. So there isn't any labor movement. So, you know, at the time in '68, those huge demonstrations had trade union people. So the working class, in whatever they were working in, had a politics that made sense to them, that involved both work and society. But now, especially in the U.S., there is no politics for ordinary people, and what they respond to is distant social changes, which seem contrary to their everyday experience, and no material prospect. I don't know how that happened, but that certainly must be a significant rebuke to how we saw things.
It's fascinating what's happening now, in that people are very well aware that it's not working for them. And as you say, there's been no real change in 5 decades.
That's kind of staggering.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah, at the
hard
same
to
time,
take in.
I don't know, perhaps because it's masked through the fact that it gets more comfortable. People have obviously become more comfortable. The technology's taken them forward, and so there is this perhaps illusion that actually, you know, it is improving. And in fact, it hasn't.
Right.
And perhaps now, particularly with the Occupy movement, you know, with the 80s and credit and everything else, creating an environment where, you know, you do have this 1% who are fabulously wealthy and increasingly wealthy, and actually benefiting from the recession, which is horrifying. And I think people are, and combining that with social media and everything else, people are far more aware, I think, than ever before of what's going on. And I mean, that's interesting if we think back to.
Well, I'm not sure they're more aware. As I recall, as I heard on the radio, that after the Brexit vote, the most common question on Google was, "What is the EU?"
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
So people voted to leave the EU, and most of them didn't know what the EU was.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that. So it looks like that perhaps people know more, but I'm not sure they do.
That's enormously disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the proliferation of information does not mean that people are more informed.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, if you go back to the '60s in the U.S., there were very few sources of information, but everybody was aware of them.
Yeah.
You know, everybody watched, Cronkite on the news or whatever it was. And so there was at least something that everybody knew.
Yeah.
Or in any event, the information had come from a source.
Yeah.
If you didn't like that source, you went to some other information. You could search. But I'm not sure that the proliferation of information has actually made people more informed. It's made some people more informed. But the mass of the population, I'm really not sure.
Because, I mean, talking about sources of news, sources of information, did you read particular journals back then? Academic journals, or?
I don't think I've read any academic journals.
No, like the New York Review of Books or anything like that?
Yeah, the New York Review of Books.
Yeah.
Yeah, the New York Review of Books, Times, the newspapers.
Yeah.
And in England, the New Statesman and so forth.
Yeah.
there were probably, you know, the New Left was not short of little newspapers, and you know, Mother Jones started then here, the magazine Mother Jones.
Yeah.
But everybody, you know, there were thousands of those. So,
Yeah.
but I don't think I read any academic journals. So
No,
it
no.
didn't seem like that was going to be an informative place at the time.
It makes me feel better though. No, that's great. I think, yeah, that about wraps up what
Okay.
I want to